Hello, everyone. We will start with this webinar. Welcome all to this event on why co-creation and knowledge brokering can unleash equitable, inclusive, and sustainable outcomes, organized by the Climate and Development Knowledge Network from South-South North. Well, this event is part of the webinar series that the PCCB, Paris Committee on Capacity Building Network, organizes every year. My name is Christina, and I'm part of the PCCB network team. And before we deep dive into this webinar, and for those that are not familiar with the PCCB network, the PCCB network is a platform that was launched a few years ago to share information on good practices, contribute to the work of the PCCB in fulfilling its mandate, and connect stakeholders engaged in climate-related capacity building across sectors and regions. As of today, the PCCB network brings together more than 400 organizations from all over the world, and they are all actively engaged in strengthening capacities for climate action. These organizations have been sharing knowledge, building partnerships, and learning from one another through this vibrant platform in the last years. If you would like to become a member of the network, you will be able to find more information in the chat. And finally, I would like to share that we have 3 more member-led events this year. So I would like to ask you to stay connected through our communication channels, including our internal newsletters, the PCCB network app, our website, and the LinkedIn group. Thank you so much. I will end here and I will give the floor to Lucia Scodanipio, Learning and Knowledge Brokering Lead from the Climate and Development Knowledge Network from South-South North, who will moderate the rest of the event. So to you, Lucia.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you for having me and hosting me to the PCCB. So let me start by sharing my screen. Excuse me, the correct screen. Let me find the presentation. Here we go. So I'm very excited to be sharing today some of the lessons that CDKN has been learning about how knowledge brokering and co-creation approaches can really help to unleash more just and sustainable outcomes. And before we start and to set the scene, I wanted to talk a little bit about the types of problems that we are dealing with. So if we look on the right-hand side of this graph, we can see that in the case of simple and complicated problems, these have a linear relationship between cause and effect. When we talk about simple problems, it's quite perceivable and predictable. When we talk about complicated problems, the relationship between cause and effect may be separated over time and space. However, in both cases, if we have expert knowledge, we can resolve these type of problems. In the complicated case, we may need more disciplines, but they are easy to solve if we apply ourselves and analyze the problem. What happens with complex problems is a little bit different. Here we no longer have a linear relationship between cause and effect, which means these problems are quite unrepeatable and the issues are emergent and keep changing. They're also quite contested, which means that we have to involve multiple knowledge cultures and undertake more transdisciplinary participatory processes to really understand these problems and the causes behind them. So when we talk about some of the problems that we face today, like climate change or poverty reduction, we can define them as being complex. This is because they are caused by multiple root causes, which means that we cannot just respond to them with the best practice through simply expert knowledge. In fact, we need to have multiple actors involved. We need to have multiple perspectives to really understand how to address them, and collective action and therefore co-creation. And also because the nature of the problem is continuously changing, we really have to reflect and learn continuously about the problem to be adaptive and iterative and flexible, but also to identify new windows of opportunity. And finally, it's also very important to understand that some people are benefiting from the status quo, from the way things are right now. So it's really important to understand like how the system is working and where the power lies, particularly if we want to have these more just and equitable outcomes and the transformation that we're talking about so much. So for today, I will take you on a small journey that normally takes 3 days. We normally have a 3-day workshop in CDCAN to strengthen knowledge brokering capacities. And today we'll just whiz a little bit through it, but it's really to show you and hopefully motivate you to see the value of knowledge brokering and co-creation to achieve these lasting and just outcomes. But before we start, I think it would be very nice to hear from all of you to see what do you understand when you hear the term knowledge brokering? Like what comes to mind? What do you think of? Because there are many perceptions about it, so it would be very nice to hear. So if you have a phone, you can scan the QR code. Otherwise, there's a code here. If you go into menti.com, you can type in 72. Putting the link in. So I will stop sharing, hoping that those of you who want to use the QR code have been able to already scan it, so that we can share the results coming through in the Menti. But yeah, this is an invitation. If any of you are having trouble to access the Menti, you're also very welcome to put your thoughts in the chat box around what you think means knowledge brokering. Like what is your understanding of this word? And let me also share the screen for the Mentimeter. So I see the results are starting to come in. Some of you are talking about translation of information. It's my job, very interesting. I would love to hear more about it, and I hope that in the Q&A we can share. Some of you are talking about co-creation, sharing information jargon-free. So definitely there is that role of making the information more understandable in an effective way as well, facilitating knowledge transfer from one community to another. Definitely that is part of it. Knowledge sharing, co-learning, of course, learning together. Go Between really talks about this intermediary role, a bridge between knowledge production and knowledge use. Definitely, that is one definition you will see very shortly in my presentation. Ensuring knowledge is captured and delivered to relevant people who need it in a way they understand. Very nice definition that talks to the tailoring, the comprehensible aspect of ensuring that it can be understood, the information, co-creating information, bridging gaps between end users and policy developers, definitely. So it's not even just between those who produce the information, but it's also between the end users and the policy users, because we have such a constellation of actors. Making sure the knowledge reaches those who need it, exchanging knowledge. So again, that learning aspect, as we exchange, communicating science and what it means. So the communication aspect definitely is there. I love this, overcoming power imbalances as much as possible, because that is one of the biggest challenges we face in both co-creation and knowledge brokering processes. And the process of connecting people, ideas, and information to facilitate the creation, sharing knowledge. Very nice. I would like to know if you had to Google that, or if that is your knowledge, which it's great though to see again the issue of connecting, and it's not just the people. No, it's about the ideas and the information, and making information accessible for different users. Great. I think we have a lot in here. I don't know if there are any last ones coming in. For the knowledge change. So it's also about that effectiveness, and pathways for change, I think, really points us towards the action. What do we want to do thanks to this knowledge, and how do we bridge that knowledge to action gap? I think that's a key aspect that we'll definitely be talking about a lot in the presentation that is about to come. And here, information accessibility, that is also definitely part of it. So I think we have a great platform to start with all of these ideas coming from you. So I think I will stop sharing the Mentimeter. Of course, if some of you are still eager to share, please do put in, and we will definitely also share later the results of the Mentimeter, and I hope also the presentation with all of you if you're interested. But let's start then from understanding really what is knowledge brokering. So when we look at the academic literature, despite the controversies in the term broker, which is not what we're referring to, knowledge brokers are understood as those who link the producers and the users of knowledge to strengthen the generation, dissemination, and use of that knowledge. If we look at this knowledge brokering spectrum, we see a variety of activities and roles that knowledge brokers take on. So starting from the left-hand side of the spectrum, as intermediaries, they help to filter through the deluge of information that is out there and to make it accessible. So they categorize it neatly, such as we would find, for example, on an online knowledge portal or in a library. When we go further along the spectrum, the knowledge translators help to summarize and synthesize information and tailor it very much according to the stakeholders that we want to communicate or influence with our knowledge. So keeping in mind what are their needs, what they find relevant and credible. When we come to the co-creator, here we realize that it's not just about translating technical knowledge and making it understood, but it's really about then bringing together different knowledge types and connecting different stakeholders. And in that process, strengthening capacities, for example, to use information, identifying synergies, and developing not just new knowledge, but maybe even interventions or responses to some of the challenges that we face. Finally, the innovation broker realizes that we may have the perfect knowledge well understood, we may have brought people together, but if we don't address some of these more systemic challenges that we face that may be tied to technological divides or institutional or social divides, for example, differences in value systems, in knowledge systems, in power, in incentive structures, maybe fragmentation in the fact different sectors do not work together, patriarchal norms, unless we address some of these deeper systemic barriers, we will not really be successful at achieving this more sustainable, lasting, and equitable change. So here you really get a sense of the variety of roles that knowledge brokers can take on. When we looked at the literature, we also saw that in the climate field, it's not very well developed. The knowledge brokering literature is much more developed in the health field. With the exception of the Climate Knowledge Brokers Manifesto that came out around 2015, and that defines climate knowledge brokers as those who broker the transfer of knowledge about climate from a person or organization to another via the medium of information. So we see they're very much focusing on the left-hand side of the spectrum. However, when we see what the IPCC is telling us in terms of our priorities, this is really around adaptation action. So as intermediaries, knowledge translators, that is just one aspect of getting to action. So it's important then to take a small journey now to see how do we bridge the knowledge to action gap and what is the role of the knowledge broker in doing that. So if we start at the bottom, we can already see that information is not the same as knowledge. If we see knowledge is really something that is acquired and that is made our own, so we have to meet a number of criteria for information to become knowledge, starting from the credibility. So this may be the technical adequacy of the information, but also it's very dependent on who we talk to. So for example, a farmer may find that the information coming from the traditional rainmaker or from the indigenous, like a leader that knows about the medicinal plants in the area is much more credible than what they may receive from a scientist coming from the capital of the country where they live. The salience is tied very much to what people think is relevant. So here it's about, once again, if we think of the farmer, what do they need? Maybe they need weather information to decide whether to harvest their crops or not. So they will want it for the following maybe 2 or 3 days, and they will want it very downscaled to the area where they live. They won't want to know what will happen with the weather in the whole country for the next month. And finally, legitimacy is about really thinking about the process through which the knowledge is created. Was it unbiased? Did it keep in mind the different perspectives? Was it respectful? Was it objective, the process? So to just make this maybe a little bit more real, we can see an example. So when the last assessment report of the IPCC was released, CDKN worked with some of the authors of the IPCC report from the African Climate and Development Initiative to develop fact sheets for the different Africa regions. So we can see here the West Africa fact sheet. And this took, of course, into consideration the context. So they went through all of the long reports and just extracted the information that was relevant to a West African audience. They ensured it was comprehensible, so they translated it to French, Arabic, and the relevant languages for the region. And they also ensured that they took out the jargon, some of you said earlier, no, to make the terminology understood to a more lay audience, but also inserting a lot of figures, infographics, graphs to make it as understandable as possible. And then also the issue of credibility was taken into account because CDCAN is a knowledge broker that has been around for the past 15 years, and the ACDI authors were involved in developing the report. So of course, whatever output was produced was going to be considered credible. Another example is some work we did in the last phase of CDCAN around assessing the economic impacts of climate change in Uganda for different sectors: transport, energy, agriculture. And here it was about influencing budgetary allocations to climate adaptation issues. So the results were very valued by the Ministry of Finance because they showed that the cost of adaptation was going to be 20 to 24 times lower than the cost of inaction. So it gave them a justification to see it's worth investing in adaptation because we will save later on. It was also considered to be comprehensible because, again, there were high-level summaries along with the long reports that were targeted to a more lay decision-making audience of the report. It was considered legitimate because the consultants that were working on the report and on this work were based in Kampala. They were having monthly meetings with the Ministry of Water and Environment that was championing this work and continuously involved in a process of trust and relationship building. And it was something that was considered very salient and relevant at the time because the country was also working on its nationally determined contribution, on the National Development Plan, and on updating its climate change strategy. So all of this work was happening at the perfect time to feed into these policy processes that were ongoing at the same time. So as knowledge translators, it's very important to keep in mind these criteria if we want to influence our stakeholders and have our knowledge used. However, it's not just about producing reports and policy briefs and documentaries, but it's about really understanding in which way people already communicate and assimilate information. So our colleagues in Northern Ghana found that women are responsible for communicating key issues in their communities through songs. So they sing about children's health or malnutrition. So we worked with them to talk about climate change and the impacts they were facing, how they're adapting, how to reduce vulnerabilities. And then they started singing now about climate change to raise awareness about these issues in the communities where they live. So it's about using the means of communication that are already working and not coming with something that may be irrelevant or inappropriate for the audiences with whom we want to communicate. Working with young people, we have found found that games and interactive activities really help them to learn and to understand key issues that may be very complex otherwise to explain just through PowerPoints. So it's once again about thinking about how do we engage and communicate with the people that we want to influence. It's not though just about translating the knowledge, no, and communicating. It's about bringing together different knowledge types. And the IPCC told us that we have to bring together not just the scientific knowledge, but also the indigenous, the local, the practical, the experiential knowledge. And so the role then of the knowledge broker becomes to ensure that we smoothen out the hierarchies that exist, unfortunately, between these different knowledge types, and to help people make sense and understand each other when we use different languages or terminologies across different disciplines, but even more so when we bring in different types of experiences and perspectives using, for example, indigenous cosmovisions. And it's also about then creating safe spaces for these different voices to be comfortable and to be heard in settings that sometimes can be very formal and not friendly or safe to different types of participants. When we move forward, though, it's not just about knowledge, as we were saying. No, if we want to influence decision making, we have to keep in mind a number of different factors. And this is where the knowledge, rules, values framework can come in very useful. So what it means is that when we want to keep in mind the rules, it's about looking both at the formal rules, which may be regulations, policies, legislation, directives, but also the informal rules, which may be tied to cultural norms or practices, taboos, behaviors, because if our knowledge contradicts either the formal or informal rules, we won't be very successful at influencing a decision process or the stakeholders that we want to work with. Similarly, we have to keep in mind what are their goals, what are their priorities, agendas, what do they consider important, what are their values, and what do they consider worthy? Because once again, if our knowledge contradicts what people's values or priorities are, we won't be very successful at influencing them. And finally, I don't think we need to define what politics is, but really we see it right now, no? We have perfect knowledge, sufficient knowledge to really say what we need to do to solve the climate challenge, but politics and power are really getting into the way. So these are issues that are critical to be navigated as knowledge brokers, because we can see that knowledge becomes a very small element in this broader decision-making system, which is characterized by lots of different actors, institutions, and processes. So what this means then for knowledge brokers is that if we want to achieve lasting outcomes, we really have to understand the governance landscape and the stakeholders that we want to influence. What are their visions, missions, policies, priorities? So if we look at some examples from our colleagues in the University of Namibia, they have been wanting to influence the Ministry of Gender to take into consideration climate issues, but also to look at gender in terms of intersectionality. So they looked at their work plan of the Ministry of Gender and saw that they had a grant that was planned and budgeted for income generating activities for women. So they decided to help them improve this grant by bringing in an element of adaptive capacities and climate change to ensure that these income generating activities were actually reducing people's vulnerabilities and enhancing resilience. And also that they were selecting not just women versus men, but women of particular backgrounds, whether it was tied to maybe the ethnic group they were part of, or their age, or the socioeconomic status, or whether they were single or married, to ensure that they were really reaching the most marginalized groups of women. So they layered on their issues to something that the ministry was already doing and had already budgeted for. Similarly, the UNAM colleagues really wanted to decentralize climate issues. And they saw that the Office of the Prime Minister in charge of the disaster risk reduction agenda has committees, disaster risk management committees, all the way down to village level. So by working with them to bring in climate change adaptation into the disaster risk reduction agenda, they could also help to decentralize climate issues all the way down to the local level. If we look at another example from our colleagues Liebert in Nepal, we see that they saw that the Ministry of Agriculture had an environment-friendly model agriculture program and vision that they wanted to bring in place in a number of provinces in the country, but they didn't have a way to operationalize it or to even have the capacities to really know how do we do environment-friendly agriculture. So Liebert, the NGO we collaborated with, developed, for example, a compendium on climate-smart agriculture technologies and practices to show what this means in practice in different agroecological regions in the countries. They also developed a training program for farmer cooperatives, extension officers, local government units about how we do climate-smart agriculture. And they helped then with technical assistance to operationalize a plan through fiscal measures, through work plans, so that they would be able to assist the government to do something that they had already envisioned, but they were not able to fully implement. So this is how we can try to have these more lasting, sustainable outcomes, is if we partner and help the stakeholders that we want to work with do their job better. Similarly, when we are working on knowledge outputs, it's not just about releasing them onto our websites. We have seen recently some posts on LinkedIn saying how many of the UN reports are not being read. And that may be because they're just being put out there on a website, but there is no real engagement strategy around how do we use that knowledge? How do we make it lead to action? So, for example, again, our colleagues in Namibia, they undertook research to look at what would be the effects of a 1.5 or 2 degree temperature rise on different sectors of the economy. But they didn't just put the results, even though they were nicely tailored, onto the website. They used these and brought them into vulnerability and risk assessment workshops that were done in conjunction with the government, researchers, NGOs, but also very marginalized stakeholders like farmers, basket weavers, women's groups, to co-develop responses around how will we reduce the impacts of the climate change, like the temperature rise, on these different sectors. What responses will we take? What needs to happen? In Nepal, something similar happened where the South Asia Institute of Advanced Studies worked with some of the municipalities to help address urban water supply issues. And this was done by setting up a water forum, a Pani Chautari, which is really a co-creation platform that brings together different knowledge types. So the government officers that were working at municipal level in charge of urban water supply issues, the water user committees, the women's groups, the farmers, all to brainstorm together how to overcome urban water supply issues, and then go and implement some of the responses that were developed in that co-creation platform, learn from them, bring back the learning into the forum, and then keep having this iterative process, which became very successful and that actually managed to prevent putting in place some of these engineering measures that were actually being planned to transfer water from one catchment to another, just because the different actors involved, including, for example, the private sector, could take measures to reduce, for example, the amount of water that they were using. What is critical is that this is really accompanied, and in both cases it was, by like long-term processes of relationship and trust building, which often can happen very informally through taking a cup of tea together to discuss how do we implement what came out of the Pani Chautari, or also communicating informally through WhatsApp. In many cases, this works well for quick and efficient communication, or really using the networks that we have to open doors and really like help to build relationships for these more lasting outcomes. When we have influenced the decisions, though, we haven't really got into action. No, we know, for example, that we have so many good policies out there, but they're not really being implemented. So how do we get to action? And this is where we, of course, have to consider capacities like human, financial resources, time, skills, but importantly, also really the effect of motivation and unfortunately tied to political will, which comes with this power and differences in values and interests. And really, I think as climate practitioners and researchers, the need to really understand how does behavior change happen? How do we motivate people to take action? So this is an area where CDKN is still learning. We have some ideas of things that work to get towards action, but we would love to learn more and love to collaborate with any of you who are also working on this. But of course, one way is by co-organizing activities together and once again, co-creating together. So for example, in Ghana, one of the challenges faced is that farmers in the Upper West region where we are working do not have access to much information about like climate change, climate smart agriculture. So we partnered with the Department of Agriculture at the local level to open up these climate advisory resource center that would bring information about drought-resistant varieties, resistant seeds, how to adapt to climate change, to these spaces where farmers then could come and learn about whatever it is that they needed. Of course, very tailored information for that region of Ghana, but that was already in existence and was not being used. But partnering with the Department of Agriculture meant that that center still exists, even though the project has now moved on. In a similar vein, we have worked with the Green Africa Youth Organization to add value to their Africa Youth Negotiators training program, which takes young negotiators to the COP. So for example, last year, we partnered with them to ensure that like each of these young negotiators was matched to a senior negotiator in Ghana and was in charge of a particular track, whether it was gender or just transitions or the global stock take, so that they knew exactly that when they went to the COP, they were following a particular track, they were responsible for it, they were mentored by a particular senior negotiator, and they were their left hand. And also to ensure that when they came back, they would take commitments about what they would implement in their work, in their communities once they got back from the COP, and really make it a more rounded process rather than just a visit to Azerbaijan without really anything concrete emerging. It's also really important that if we want these action and lasting outcomes, we promote learning from on the ground. So pilot projects, demonstrations, peer learning have been known to be very effective. Like we know that seeing is believing. So it's really critical to show people what is working, to inspire them to then take action and adapt what they have seen to their own context. Also, it's critical to create platforms where different stakeholders can come together, build relationships, identify synergies, and really try to get to these more lasting and just outcomes. So in Ethiopia, our colleagues have been now working with firstly the Ministry of Finance and now the Ministry of Planning and Development that is chairing a community of practice in charge of mainstreaming climate change and gender issues. And this brings together all of the relevant actors working on either climate change or gender, including youth groups now, to talk about how will we advance these issues, how will we get to action? How will we mainstream them? In Ghana, again, we also have recently undertaken a national dialogue with the newly appointed State Minister of Climate and Sustainability to really see how do we bridge the knowledge to action gap? How do we transform the talk into actual commitments? So this was a multi-sectoral dialogue done with government, research partners, civil society, youth and gender networks, and the media, because it was both shown on TV and the radio. And it was really about taking commitments and seeing how do we get to action, but bringing together these different perspectives to have very honest conversations about what is needed. And now all of those discussions are being followed up on with concrete follow-up steps. When we do co-creation and have these platforms, it's really important to consider the marginalized, no, and ensure that we bring in these intersectional factors, and ensure that we're hearing the voices that are not normally heard. And this is also what the IPCC is telling us, no, to prioritize issues of equity and justice, and really understand that it will be challenging because there are different interests and values out there. But how do we create these spaces where we can create this joint understanding of issues and where we can shift people to try to work towards common and joint visions that are ultimately we all, I think, care for to have more just outcomes, more equitable outcomes, but how do we work together to make those happen? And finally, what also knowledge brokers really need to do is to help to connect stakeholders to different sources of knowledge or intermediaries, because often we find this fragmentation in the system. So this may be about helping to connect women's group to local governments where they can get registered, and so that they can then access loans from the local banks to get financing, for example, for income generating or livelihood activities. Similarly, the East Africa Grain Council worked with a number of stakeholders along the value chain, the agricultural value chain, to strengthen the connections between them so that the farmers, for example, would have direct access to the input suppliers, to the providers of weather information, to the climate services, to the providers of technology for reducing post-harvest losses, to the markets themselves, because everybody was working in quite a disconnected way. So by those small bridges between them, the system then can work much better. So it's about how, once again, do we reach these more sustainable outcomes and actions that then can take place even without our presence as knowledge brokers. So with that, I hope it has been clear that it's not sufficient to only focus on the left-hand side of the spectrum. Of course, this is critical, but for these more just long-term outcomes, we really have to go much more towards the co-creation and the innovation brokering side of the spectrum, where we're really dealing with these more underlying systemic barriers like differences in values or worldviews or power. And so we have also come up with our own definition of knowledge brokering as a result of the past 5 years of learning about them. And we define them as facilitators of change that are seeking to strengthen relationships and networks and understanding on the climate challenge, but really based on different types of knowledge and experience. So we ensure both better decisions are taken, but ultimately we get to action. In the process, of course, we will be navigating many different challenges tied to the politics, differences in values, in rules, in goals, in capacities. But this is really where the challenge lies for us as knowledge brokers. But I hope I gave you some examples to see how we can really try to navigate some of these issues. Of course, if you're interested in hearing more about this, we have our webpage, the Knowledge for Change series page, where we have a number of our learning stories, a paper, a brief, the recording also of a webinar, and many blogs about where we keep sharing what we are learning with our partners from who are based in 3 regions in the world. So with that, I think I will stop and give space for questions, for reflections, to also hear whether this is resonating with anyone. So I think I will stop sharing and open the floor for hearing from you. I don't know if there have been any questions in the chat. I see something around sharing the recording. And somebody from Uganda, I'm interested in discussing more with the prospect of including health in the estimates. So Mudarshiro, I don't know if you would like to maybe ask your question and tell us a little bit more.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I'm from Uganda, and I'm a PhD student at Makerere University, but I'm involved in climate change and health. I'm trying to investigate the contribution of climate change on the burden of infectious diseases of pandemic potential. And one
excuse me if I interrupt you. I think someone has possibly a microphone that is not muted, so I'm struggling a little bit to hear you. But please go ahead now. I think that the background has stopped.
Okay. So one of the things that I'm interested in is to do some policy advocacy. And in my work, I'm doing some policy analysis. And from what you've shown, there is need to tell the policymakers of the burden, whether it is in agriculture, whether it is in health, because from that perspective, you can tell them more about what potential interventions they can look at, and possibly including in the local funding. But also I'm interested in trying to see how does health be part of these estimates. As we all know, it's just as recent as COP29 when the loss and damage fund was discussed, but health did not surface in the current mechanisms of loss and damage. So even at the local level, as we are telling different players that we need to include health as loss and damage for climate change funding, probably the banks and all of that, this does not ring the bell well for them. So I'm interested in discussing this more and how we can advocate this more. From the background of as a public health specialist, I can present how climate change, all the different risk factors like temperature, humidity, even air pollution, contribute to poor health outcomes and the economic burden. Yes, over. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. It sounds like you're also doing very interesting work. Yes, so I'll pick up on a couple of the things you raised. So around, yes, you were saying to tell the policymakers about the burden. Yes, it's important to tell them about, for example, the impacts of inaction, for example. And I think this is also what can be done in the health, but that is not sufficient. It's both to motivate action, create a sense of urgency. Of course, we have to talk about the problem, but then it's very much about talking about also the solution. So what are the actions that can be taken to solve this problem? What are the very specific recommendations to help to overcome some of the challenges? And then it's about working very closely with them, as I was saying earlier. It's not just about documenting and giving them, here is a report with all of the information, but it's about really then seeing how do we work together to try to overcome this? And how do we bring different actors together in the health field, for example, maybe some of the hospitals or some of the medical staff, or some of the, of course, researchers working on those issues, some of the practitioners, like maybe the Doctors Without Borders. Like, how do we bring all of the different actors together, both to create a critical mass of voices that are saying these issues are important, they need to be addressed, and we see more and more, no, the link between climate change and health, whether it is because of the diseases that are like becoming more prominent because of rises in temperature, because of flooding, whether it's the heat issue, no, like indoor heat. So I think we are starting to develop a nice body of knowledge, but knowledge is not sufficient. That is where working together and creating these platforms or using existing platforms, that's just as important. No, sometimes there maybe already be a government platform that is talking about these issues, but maybe they're not addressing the issue fully. And therefore, how can you become an agenda item in their already existing meetings, so that you don't create something new, but you tell them, look, we have done this research, we have these results, like we have other partners who are interested in helping you to do your work better. So it's about firstly raising the item on the agenda so that people think like, oh, this is critical, it's urgent, and you do that through knowledge, but then ensuring that you work with them to help solve the issue and to find the responses, understanding that we'll have to learn. No, we don't have all the perfect answers. These are complex issues. There are many causes which we were saying at the beginning, but then we can also help to identify from different perspectives what may be some possible responses, and then try to get to that action that we're talking about. So the knowledge brokering, it cuts across any field. It's not just for climate change and not health. No, like the techniques you would use are the same. It's just then adapting it to the particular piece of content that you work on. So I hope I have answered a little bit your question, very much from a knowledge brokering lens. I see something from Carlos. So you mentioned co-developing knowledge with engagement strategies for long-term change. However, there is now evidence of unprecedented events in a changing climate that require short-term strategies, which may affect the engagement process. Very interesting question. I think what we have seen is we are now going for quite short-term strategies at the moment. I would not say that co-creation and bringing together multiple perspectives is the status quo, and yet I don't think we're being very successful. So I know that the problem is urgent, but I think it's about also seeing where do we invest time and what is it worth investing time in. And my personal belief, and what we have been learning in CDKN, is that investing time in bringing together stakeholders, in trying to understand the problem more holistically, in ensuring we have all of those voices, including the marginalized voices, will ensure that then the results are more equitable. No, I think that we can take shortcuts and think like, oh, it's too urgent, we don't have time to work with others. But we are seeing that the results then are not sustainable. They're not equitable, like the inequality is increasing. So my view is that we have to change. We have to convince donors and governments to invest in the time that it takes for something to really be lasting and just. Because as things are at the moment, I don't think that we are really getting those outcomes. So I hope it may be controversial. I would love to hear if others disagree with me, but I think this is what we're finding. And maybe I see Martin has a question, so let me perhaps just take that one, because then I would love us to have a moment for you to also take a look at something else that we want to share with you. So how can we institutionalize this vast area of skills, competencies, and enablers? Many of these feel like aspects that often fall between the cracks. This feels almost like the personalization and institutionalization of walking the extra mile. Is this a package to be turned into mandates and rules? Is it a discrete profession? So I, it's yeah. I think that it's definitely not something that we can do alone. A knowledge broker cannot work in isolation. We need to work in partnership. Just because I think we have seen the breadth of the challenge and the topic that we're dealing with. And as climate practitioners, we are not experts in political economy and power and communication and behavior change and psychology. So I think it really shows the need to work as part of teams. And and I also think that, yeah, I would love to see this a bit more institutionalized, but I think that comes to really starting from the university level. How do we ensure that climate change researchers, students are being exposed to knowledge brokering, that they really see that actually if we want to work on these complex issues, it's not the exposure risk and vulnerability model that will help us, or the climate modeling that will help us deal with the complexity of the challenge. It's really if we know how to work with different stakeholders. So and are able to handle the complexities, the conflict that may emerge between different stakeholders. So I'm not sure if I'm fully responding to you, Martin, but I think that definitely it has to be something that we start to institutionalize more and do it across like different sectors, or not just in academia, but also with the practitioners, with intermediaries, but so really talk more honestly about like the systems thinking, the complexity, the root causes, and how do we address that. So and difficult in this transactional world for sure, also tied to what Carlos was asking earlier. So with that, let's see if, let's definitely have future conversations, but I would like to show you something else before we round off, which is about some cards that we have used in a more in-person setting. But I would like you to maybe take a couple of minutes and see, what do you think are the key issues you need to consider for your climate action work to be most impactful? So I will be showing you on my screen all of these different cards that we normally play with in person, but I would like you to see whether any of these talk to you. So as you think about your climate action work, what you really feel are some of the key priorities, and maybe Christina, if needed, we can put the question in the chat box. What do you think are some of the key issues you need to consider for your climate action work to be impactful? And I'm happy with everyone maybe raising their hand or just unmuting and telling us like what talks to you out of all of these cards, that you think for your work, this will make a difference. Like you will possibly be able to be more impactful if you really are able to consider this factor. So you're welcome to type in the chat or simply unmute and share. We can use maybe 5 minutes because then the closing will be very quick. But I would like us to also engage around this and to hear more perspectives. So I hope your screens are big enough. I know that it's a very small text, but I hope you are being able to take a look and comment. I actually do not see the chat, but maybe I leave this visible for a minute, and then I will stop sharing so that I can actually see the chat. But otherwise, please do unmute. What do you feel you need to address or consider for your work to be most impactful? And with that, I think I stop sharing. I'm sure you've had a chance to take a look at the screen. and see whether, oh, thank you. I see that we do have a little bit in the chat. So Olivia, I see you're saying priorities. Nikki, you think it's about trust. Please do share if any of you, oh, Prophet DG, nice to see you. I think you may have jumped off already. Decision-making processes, some of you are talking about. I would like to hear more. So if any of you would like to expand on what you have written, please, yes, go ahead. I'm not sure who had unmuted. So Neth is talking about change. Prof. Mudashiro is talking about the different types of knowledge, scientific, indigenous, local. Carlos is really saying about how we have to understand the context. Martin, the responsibility. So what is our role? Yvonne, you're talking about creativity and knowledge gaps, collaboration, relationships. And Princess, you're mentioning about awareness. Michele, the relations of power and hidden interests. And yeah, decision-making processes. Would anyone like to share? We can hear. Oh, Carlos, so nice. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. Nice to see you, Lucia.
Yes.
Well, why did I say context? I think this is quite critical. We have a meeting with the work package team, research teams, and the living labs, trying to actually understand the context of how we want to validate the core message, coming from the scientific outputs. So we're just trying to understand how we're gonna validate that knowledge with institutions, but because the living labs are not working straight with the communities, but we're working with the humanitarian institutions to support informing regional planning for the future. So I think the context I was, to harmonize the way we're communicating and and also for the living labs, understanding the science itself. I mean, that's why I was thinking also on the engagement process, starting from inside the project, now from the work package, the living labs, so that's an initial engagement process that has started to understand the context on how we want to translate the science to support the communities and inform the humanitarian aid organizations. So I just wanted to say why I chose context.
Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, maybe just to add on that, so when we want to understand our context, maybe it's also seeing what are some of the agendas, of these humanitarian institutions, what exactly are they working on, and how does your knowledge emerging from the living labs align so that you help them do their work better, like you're adding value.
Exactly. The idea is to iterate that to, for the work package for the researchers to know where the science is going to fit in to support specifically climate solution. So that's the idea, iterate the engagement process in that way.
Great. Thank you for sharing. I see we have another hand from Romaine.
Hi, Lucia. I hope that you're well, and thank you so much for this great presentation. So I was thinking about trust as well, and the reason for trust is I'm thinking about how, as knowledge brokers, you need to be building, there's different worlds that you need to think about. And when it comes to, particularly the climate and health space, you are communicating with scientists, health practitioners, or even health scientists, climate scientists, but you're also communicating with communities, NGOs, policymakers, and everybody has their own way of understanding and using different ways or different jargons, different languages, and also have different priorities. And when you think about all of these different differences, it's far easier to sort of mistrust each other. And so I think that building that trust is, especially in spaces like, the learning labs that was already mentioned, it creates a space where you can engage more openly and share more honestly. And then I think that's when people or these different spaces start to take each other more seriously, instead of thinking, if I'm the scientist, you listen to me, or yeah. So it helps. I think it helps knowledge brokers, those people sitting at the interface between scientists and practitioners, for example, really need to think about how to build trust before anything else. And I think building trust also leads people within these engagements to develop a sense of agency as well, depending on how you are able to facilitate that and how you are able to build that trust between yourself and the others. And then the other thing about trust is that it really can help build these long-term engagements, not just for what you're working on now, but there could be a future project or a future space for that engagement that might be quite critical. But you've already built that trust or started building that trust now. So in those cases, it can be quite sustaining. So yeah, I'm thinking about it from that way. And then last thing would be thinking about, how you mediate power dynamics and conflicts once you have built that trust.
Thank you, Romain, for sharing such important points, and I love the link to agency. I think with that, we are at over time by 1 minute, and I know that Christina asked us to take a photograph. So I don't know if that would require people maybe putting on their camera, I imagine, so that we can take a photograph before we all go. But thank you so much to all of you for staying this long and for engaging. I'm sorry that we never have enough time to really hear from everyone, but lovely to have this engagement with all of you.
Okay, so I will take the. Thank you so much, Lucia, and I will take the picture now. So if everyone could switch on their cameras, please. Okay, it's good. Thank you so much for everyone for being here.
Okay, then thank you very much again, and thank you, Christina and Eva, for hosting us, and all the best to everyone. And yes, I'm sure we will be sharing resources with everyone. Have a lovely day.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Lucia. Bye.
Bye.
You said something like